Hello everybody, welcome to this Energy Rev Governance Insight Lunchtime Seminar. Today we're going to be talking about local energy systems in the UK, where and why. I'm Poppy Maltby, Head of Cities and Regions at Regen, and I want to thank Rev for inviting me to chair today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I'm going to go a bit of an intro before we launch into the seminar today about quickly who Energy Rev are. So they're a research consortium of 22 universities who are looking at smart local energy systems. They're part of the UK's government's Prospering from the Energy Revolution programme, or PREFER, as I guess the acronym goes. The aim of Energy Rev is to support and learn from that programme. And this event in particular is going to explore some of the implications that the learnings have for future governance and policies. This is the third seminar in the series. Earlier ones have looked at post-pandemic recovery and the second has looked at skills. You can watch the recordings of both on Energy Rev's website. You can also sign up there for future events, and a link will hopefully show up for you to click on. Right, so our agenda for today, we've only got an hour. So we're going to be hearing from two presenters. We've got Dr. Callum Rae, and he's going to be talking about his project to produce a GIS map of local energy system projects. We've then got Dr. Theo Arvanitopoulos, who are going to be taking us through local conditions associated with those projects. And after these presentations, which should be 10 to 15 minutes, we're going to be opening up for questions, and the speakers are going to be joined by Professor Charlie Wilson for that panel discussion. On that topic, we really want to hear your questions for that panel session, and you can submit any questions you've got throughout the event via the Q&A function, which hopefully, if it's the same as mine, is sort of a speech bubble with a question mark in it. You can do it with your name on it, or you can publish that anonymously. Maddie Morris from Imperial is going to be sorting through them and publishing them, and then you can see and upvote questions that you like, so you can put the ones that you really want to be asked up to the top of the question list. So I just encourage you to do that as you go through the presentations. And a final bit of housekeeping before we start: the event, as the others have, is going to be recorded and is going to be made available afterwards. If you need live captions, they are also available, so select captions and subtitles on in your video controls. Maddie can help you if you can't find those. Right, so we only have an hour, so I think we're going to crack straight on into our presentations. So first I will introduce Dr. Callum Rae.
Yep, thanks Poppy. Good afternoon everyone. Delighted to be taking part in this seminar this afternoon to talk you through some of the insights from our high-level review of local energy projects in the UK. So we are involved with Energy Rev through the supporting scale-up theme. So our work at Heriot-Watt is one of the 3 work packages that sit within this theme, and our focus is on the identification of barriers to upscaling of smart local energy systems. So our approach involves a number of case studies of existing or historic examples of smart local energy systems, and we're reviewing the projects and undertaking interviews with the people who were involved. And the aim here is to try and identify key barrier areas that these projects have experienced, and then suggest ways in which these barriers can be mitigated or removed in future. So the first phase of this research was to select our case studies, and the aim for this process, as is kind of vaguely shown on the right hand side, was to cast our net pretty wide and start from a large number of projects and then whittle these down using a series of criteria that we'd introduced to help us arrive at the most relevant case studies for our research. But early on in this process, it was brought to our attention that this initial phase that I've highlighted on the right hand side of this process, the compiling of our long list, if you like, was itself quite an interesting thing and might yield some interesting results. So then work began on developing this into an output, which is what I'm going to present to you today. I just wanted to start with a bit of context about how we got there, and the backstory also goes some of the way to explaining why the resulting database is the way it is. So some other important things to note about our methodology, I've listed them on the slide. We only drew from existing databases, so we gave priority to those which were most relevant to our research. So looking at energy systems, we gave priority to those databases rather than ones which leaned more heavily on, say, educational or behavioural change initiatives, ones that had community groups with maybe a broader scope than just energy. We also included information which was publicly available at the time. We were able to fill in some of the gaps, and we needed to do so to get locations for every project on our list, but we didn't have the resource to track down every single data field, and I'll circle back to that later. So this is a little bit of a wordy slide, apologies, but it shows the list of existing project databases we considered and the ones that we chose to include and why. So our choice was governed by how relevant the criteria for inclusion were to our own research aims, how accessible the data was, how much data was included in each database for each project. So you can see we selected 4 there. Theo and Charlie have done some work with the database at the top, which is the UKirk Energy Demonstrators Review, which was published in 2018. They have worked with this and expanded upon it slightly. We selected that, and the database is published by Community Energy Scotland and Community Energy England through the Community Energy Hub, as it was at the time. And we were also able to get information from the Community Energy England and Wales State of the Sector report for 2020. So we ended up with a database of information for 754 projects once we'd screened out the entries that appeared in several databases. So the end result in terms of our outputs and what was published a couple of weeks ago is the interactive map, which you can see a sort of screen grab of on the left hand side there. This plots all of the projects in our list on the map, and you can zoom in and out and select different projects. And when you click on a project, as you can kind of see in that image, the information box will pop up with all the info that we have about that particular project. There's also a number of filters at the top right that you can apply to kind of target your search to more specific areas like the technologies used, energy vectors, and so on. The second output was a user guide and summary document that just kind of explains how to use the map in a bit more detail and explains how the underlying database was compiled, also in a bit more detail than I'm able to give today, and the database itself, which is available for download as a spreadsheet. So as I've explained, our list is not completely exhaustive, so if this sort of thing is of interest, I would recommend a number of other resources that you can check out that we'll supply later on in the chat, I think. So yeah, there are a couple that we didn't have access to that are definitely worth checking out. I'd also draw your attention to a project called COPED that's recently launched and involves Bayes, Energy Systems Catapult, and Energy Rev. Definitely worth checking out. A really interesting piece of work. So the insights that I'm going to talk you through are kind of split into the insights that we have from the database itself and what it can teach us, but also the insights from the process of compiling it. So starting there, what did we learn from this process? Well, the answer is more than we expected to, even with a fairly high level approach. There is no single comprehensive source of local energy project information. That's what we were hoping to find, sadly not the case. And we also learned that making one is pretty challenging in itself. The various databases that do exist vary in the level and type of information that they contain. And this is, according to the roles and responsibilities of the compiling organisations. Often these databases exist purely as a record of the various projects and organisations that the compiling parties have supported, and it's fair to say that the creation and maintenance of these databases is not the primary role of these organisations, despite the fact that they do it pretty well. But they're not always freely available, and that limits the dissemination of the findings of some of these projects and the rate of innovation in the sector, which is its own challenge, particularly with publicly funded projects. But what we're going to talk about here is the level of insight that's possible from just basic project information. So overall, the message is that the level of information available is a bit of a mixed bag, and as a result, trying to kind of bring these together, these disparate data sets into one, is quite a challenge and results in a lot of gaps. But despite this, we were able to get quite a lot of insight, and that shows just how valuable this sort of information is and how much we can learn from it. So, as I say, even with varied and basic project information, we were still able to get some pretty useful insights into the local energy sector, and I'll give you a few examples here just to give you a flavour. So one of the things that we're interested in, and which jumps out from the data, is vectors. So energy vectors, we're talking about electricity, heat, transport and storage. And from these graphs, we can see 2/3 of the projects in our database are single vector. So because they go back a couple of decades, they mostly involve PV and wind installations. You can see from the graph on the right hand side, there's 349 electricity only projects listed in there. The next biggest one is heat, and then you're into combinations of vectors, and that's also quite interesting. So the most common combination is heat and electricity, probably unsurprisingly, and we can also see that projects which include storage or transport rarely include those vectors alone. They're usually coupled with others, and that probably says more about the funding organisations and the way those projects were structured, and the reason that they were in the source databases. Once we include project start dates, and this is only where they're available, notice how we're down to looking at 187 projects now, we can unlock another layer of analysis by looking at how local energy projects have changed over time. So the graph on the left shows the growth in multi-vector systems, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years. And this is quite significant because beforehand we'd been dealing with primarily with single vector projects. And so the shift to multi-vector projects brings with it increased design and operational complexity. Now we need to think about how we integrate these 2 or more subsystems together, the new and different skill sets required, any interactions we have between these systems and existing infrastructure and so on. So that's quite interesting to us, looking at barriers to upscaling. And the graph on the right hand side just shows really another view of this by showing the emergence of heat, transport and storage, with the latter 2 kind of showing strong growth in the last few years. One of the energy system attributes that we're really interested in within Energy Rev is smartness, and can be something of a catch-all term, but if we take it as read and just look at the number of projects in the database which describe themselves as smart, then we can see on the left-hand side that we're talking about a fairly low, fluctuating but gradually increasing number of projects. So between 2010 and the end of the data collection in 2020, less than 1/3 of the projects are described as smart. And the graph on the right-hand side shows that there's apparently a correlation between the inclusion of heat and the use of the word smart as a project descriptor. Now this might be coincidental, it might show that early examples of smart local energy systems involve the integration of heat, but it's an example of the sorts of insights that you can get from this data. So how could this be built on, and what are the main takeaways from a policy and governance perspective? Well, when we think about the 2 sorts of things that would improve this resource, 2 kind of categories emerge. The first of these relates to the resources that go into compiling and maintaining these databases. So the selection of source databases we settled on was influenced or constrained by our underlying research aims. So obviously this could be expanded. Our database only really just provides a snapshot. So updating it and sourcing all the information that's missing from it, these gaps in the data, that would require additional resource, obviously. And as we found out during the process, trying to fill in those gaps is really quite a labour-intensive process. It would be quite challenging. So that kind of brings us to the second category of factors I've got listed there, which is standardisation. So what I've discussed so far is how we can improve things from our side, what we need to do to get the most out of the information that's available. But if we shift the onus onto the sector and consider how studies like ours could be made easier, and more importantly, how knowledge sharing and dissemination, again, often from publicly funded projects, could be made more accessible and more useful, we're kind of left with these three. And one thing that would combine these kind of three items would be a move towards standardized local energy project information. If this was implemented by the sector as a whole, but mostly the compilers of these project databases, then it would achieve a level of uniformity that would enable databases to be combined and to be analysed much more easily. And again, just to stress, what we're talking about here isn't a huge leap from where we are now. We don't need a detailed breakdown of project financials. We're talking about location, start date, technologies used, information like that. From our perspective is what we'd like to see. And again, yeah, this is our perspective, but we'd welcome others. So if you have any other suggestions, please drop them in the Q&A. We'd be delighted to hear them. Just to summarise then, it's clear that there's considerable insight to be gained from existing and historic examples of local energy projects, but this is only as accessible as the project information itself. And while there's loads of information out there, it does vary in its format and its content. So if a standard project data format could be adopted, this would really unlock vast amounts of relevant but latent knowledge and expertise, which has been built up in the sector. We've also provided a few examples of what we can learn from our database, and really it's open to interpretation depending on your area of interest. But at a fairly high level, it's possible to see evidence of the impact of various policy interventions and the emergence of trends like the growth in multivector and smart systems. And we've also found that having project dates in particular is really helpful, as it allows us to kind of observe these trends. And the last point just sums it up really: the more data we capture and make available, the more we can learn. And you're going to hear from Theo next, and his work really exemplifies what's possible with a higher level of project information. So I'll leave it there. That's it from me. Happy to field your questions later on. But in the meantime, if you want to get in touch, my email address is there, and the usual EnergyRev contact information is also listed. So thanks very much.
Lovely. Thank you, Callum. Oh, I've got a bit of a feedback. Sorry, I shouldn't talk until I'm live. So we're going to hand over to Theo now, and just to remind people that you can put questions in from the Q&A. I can't see many of them in there now, so there's going to be a challenge to get lots up before we finish Theo's presentation. So just to hand over to Theo now.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Theo. Great talk from Callum. Thanks very much for introducing to this concept of local energy systems and where they are located. Our work with Maltby, we try to find the reasons why local energy systems are located in the areas that they are, and you'll have the pleasure to discuss with Charlie later on at the Q&A. So starting with, I will just introduce you to our research. Bridging our research with Callum, we'll start by presenting you where these local energy systems are located within Great Britain. As Callum said, we focused on the UK energy demonstrators. With the help from colleagues from within EnergyRev, we extended a bit the dataset, so we have 149 projects from 2010 to 2020. We've allocated them across local authorities. We have in total 380 local authorities, and we got the count of those projects within it. So overall, you can see that one in 5 has at least one local energy project, and those with more than 2 are listed here, so you can see the names of those areas. Overall, I just have a brief, points to mention here. We can see, like on the left side, we can see those before 2016, and on the right hand side, you can see like all those developed till 2020. Overall, we can see that there is not a uniform distribution. It's very uneven across space, and there's no particular pattern that we can observe, that we can help us identify the reasons why they are located where they are located. We have metropolitan areas, we have cities, and we have also rural areas. So that brings us to the topic of our research. Why this is happening? We're trying to answer which are the local conditions that are necessary for LES to flourish, and which areas can capture those. To do that, we developed an econometric methodology. I won't go into that. It's fairly extensive and it's a lot of work, and it's not the focus of today's discussion. But I'll have like a 1 minute go on factors that we've identified by building an extensive data set for controlling for those factors. Those involve energy-related aspects like renewable energy projects, infrastructure and electric vehicles, access to gas grid. We've checked for local government in the sense of controlling for whether local authorities have climate action plans or trusted local partners. We've checked for local economy, so the number of businesses in tech, manufacturing, energy, different kinds of sectors, and also the effect of university towns. Also checked for socioeconomic and housing conditions, like the affluency of the area, the age of the building stock, whether there are energy efficiency improvements, etc. And finally, just some fixed factors control for them, like natural resources, whether the heating, how cold is the area, whether they have like lots of sunshine and all that stuff. So, having done this, we've concluded to some basic results, which I'll go through, and then I'll discuss the policy implications of those results in terms of scaling up local energy systems in the future within the country. So first of all, here you can see those that can enable, that we find that they have enabling factor for local energy systems, and these are mainly local strategic investment and planning around low carbon goals within local authorities. So we find, for example, that existing climate action plans and EV infrastructure are areas with those are the areas with actually having more local energy systems. And also the defining factor was tech businesses, not we control for other businesses, but tech businesses tend to be associated with less areas with local energy systems. So that overall shows this local knowledge and skills being within an area that help those projects flourish. Apart from enabling factors, we've concluded to specific to things that less help problems, like barriers that exist, constraints within areas, and less help, overcome. And these are pretty basic. One would expect balancing issues, which can be manifested by, for example, a high number of renewable energy projects within the area, or lack of major power producers within the areas associated with local energy systems, which indicates potentially supply constraints or low generation capacity. And overall areas with low access to gas are the areas with less, so that indicates reducing surplus capacity within the areas. But apart from electricity balancing constraints, we see that the LES are developed as a mean to improve efficiency of building stocks, because we see that energy inefficient areas with energy inefficient housing, and usually that owner occupied ones tend to have more LES projects, and also that indicates that local energy systems are used for upgrading housing stock efficiency. But at this point, it has to be mentioned that that's not particularly true for fuel poor areas. So it often happens in areas with a middle income or affluent areas. So it's a thing that we have to mention, that less are not, intuitively occur in areas that are fuel poor, and I'll discuss this in a brief moment. So having presented like very shortly what are the main outcomes of our research, I'll try to connect them with policy implication, so we can in the future maybe scaling up those projects. So the first that we have to mention is obviously that accumulated knowledge and experience within local authorities can help less flurries. And this is manifested by the fact that 3 out of 4 local areas with more than one LESS project have at least one partner involved in multiple projects. And that indicates the cumulative knowledge within areas. And usually in 3 out of 5 cases, this is an industry partner or a university partner. Secondly, the tech sector and technological expertise seems to be quite important for supporting those projects' flurries. So that clearly indicates the role of tech sector. I mean, other sectors would be expected to have influence as well, but tech makes a difference. This is what our results reveals. And especially areas with local businesses and universities town are more likely to have those. And if you help them accumulate this knowledge, they can even lead to more of these projects being developed. So that builds the ground for knowledge exchange and capacity building, which can be further augmented through training courses and educational programs, and that can scale up local energy systems within areas. Finally, less local energy system projects can help improve local conditions. We can see that there is association with an efficiency improvements in local energy systems, and these projects can be used to improve efficiency, especially for older houses and also houses off-grid that use other resources for heating. But it also be developed as projects in conjunction with the high use of of electric vehicles, and in conjunction with electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So it can be used as a way of balancing increasing demand on the local network. So it can help all those conditions improve. Okay. So these are the main policy implications. Having said about main results, these are the things that we believe from our results can help scaling up less in local areas within Great Britain and within the UK. However, we need to remember, as I started in my first slide, that local energy systems are unevenly distributed across the UK, right? So what about, let's say that we leave the market and we leave local conditions and those areas that are very likely to have those, they have them, and then we have a divergent economy, that areas that are disadvantaged grow, they don't have access to those technologies, but areas with are more likely they have more of those. So the inequality increases potentially. So what can we do to discourage this and to help improve those disadvantaged areas? So it's really important to remember that with these technologies and generally local energy systems, we're focusing on equitable distribution across space and across areas. And to do that, we need appropriate financial and regulatory incentives that can support this. And we need to develop small and medium-sized businesses, maybe with the help of universities, to go in these areas and help develop those projects within this area. So we're talking about local skill development, collaboration between local government and private sector, and connect those with fuel poverty policies, because we see that fuel poor areas are not the ones that have those projects, and we need those projects to alleviate fuel poverty. So all this connect together, but it's important that we have targeted policy to achieve that in those areas. And having said that, I'll just, as a final slide, and this is the extension of our research in regards to heat pumps, that we're trying to associate the local conditions, related with diffusion of heat pumps over the last 10 years within the UK. And you can see in the maps from the left to the right, from 2010 to 2020, the diffusion of those. Again, the number a cumulative number of heat pumps within local authorities. You can see, and the depth of the color indicates more. So why I'm presenting this? Because starting doing that analysis and taking on the maps, we can see a similar uneven distribution which resembles the distribution in space of local energy systems. You know, there's no uniformity, there's not like a pattern, like a spillover effect that we can see and observe, oh, this is what, you know, results of this. So we have to dig further into finding the local conditions. Apart from the fact that we can see here that, especially on the map on the right, that urban and metropolitan areas are the one with really low numbers, the white dots, and you know, the rural areas are the ones with darker colors, which is as expected for heat pumps. But apart from that, we see the same pattern with less, and that indicates that these new technologies, these novel low carbon renewable technologies that can help the transition that we're looking for in this consortium towards a sustainable low carbon economy do not happen in a uniform way. And thus, it's important to mention that targeted policies need to be taken from policymakers and in conjunction with local authorities and with private sector, so they can help actually the diffusion in areas that are disadvantaged and alleviate things like fuel poverty and such. So I want to finish with that one because I think it's a really important one, especially if we are serious about leveling up and, you know, with this agenda being brought forward. So we need to discuss about those issues and to target policies to help those disadvantaged areas, especially for those new technologies being in the first step of being developed now within the country. So yeah, that was a brief discussion. I think Charlie can have like really nice insights to continue later on and in the discussion. So it would be happy to hear him say whatever he wants to say on this topic. And I'm really happy that you invited me today and we had this great discussion.
Thanks, Theo. That's great. I've seen a few questions coming through, so please keep bringing those forward. We've got Charlie Wilson now who's going to be joining our panel, and you were going to say a few words, Charlie, just a few, I think, because we're a little bit behind on time.
Yes, thank you, Poppy. So it was to really develop the point Theo was making at the very end, that both Theo and Callum's work has shown really nicely this kind of spatial distribution of these low carbon solutions. And it raises this important question about not just how, but also where policy should be supporting net zero and just transitions. And I think there is an inevitable trade-off in answering that question between equity and effectiveness. That, as Theo was showing, you may have areas which, from a levelling up or a spatial equity perspective, you may want to target resources and support at, even though there may be other areas where, if you targeted support in those directions, you might have a more sustained diffusion pattern or more benefits, which could then have spillover effects, which would benefit other communities. And we don't see this just with local energy systems. We see this with heat pumps, as Theo was showing. We see this with electric vehicles and EV infrastructure. We see this with photovoltaics and renewables. We see this with energy efficient retrofits and so on. So how policy resolves this tension between spatial equity and spatial effectiveness, I think, is a really interesting one that it would be nice to touch on in the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. I'm just going to start asking some of the questions now. So we've got some through, which is great. And I'm going to go back to Callum just to cover some of the questions for you, Callum. The first one I had was about who do you propose will maintain this database on smart local energy systems, and who's going to fund it? And a supplementary from me, is there an example of where this has been done really well that we should learn from in other sectors or other types of learning? Okay,
sure. Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Is who's gonna take responsibility for all this? Generally, I would say that the existing databases are maintained fairly well by the compiling organisations as they are. So just by way of an example, Community Energy Scotland are currently redeveloping their online database of projects. I don't know exactly what that's going to involve, but there is a level of ongoing maintenance there. Another thing to stress is that the sort of thing that I've proposed in terms of the standardization of information isn't a huge step in terms of the work required, and a lot of this stuff is being captured to a certain extent by this kind of database management anyway. As I've noted, it's not their responsibility to kind of provide this service to studies like us who are trying to kind of analyze the data. So it could be funded as a piece of research, but I think what we have done has shown the limitations to that, partly because of the resource required, partly because of the difficulties in doing so. So I do think it would be preferable to kind of recognise the role that these kind of intermediary support organisations provide in this area, and providing support through them, because I think they're probably the best placed ones to do it. In terms of examples from other sectors, I'm not too sure, but what I would add, just as it popped into my head again, and I'll supply the link that Maddie can share, is that the COPED project is really going to build on what we've done, and it's a much more sophisticated and kind of all-encompassing undertaking in this area, and they're going to be doing things like building links between certain organisations and various projects and allow it all to be searchable. It's all going to be based on a map as well, and you'll get all sorts of project networks and things, so that's definitely worth checking out on the research side in terms of what's being done to kind of step up.
Great, thank you. So a bit of an evolution at the moment you'd recommend. So seems like some feedback needed to some of the organisations. There's been a couple of questions that we've got about, well, there was one question about defining smartness, which I think you've responded to, Callum. And then there was another one around correlation between vectors and smartness and how that may correlate again with sort of policies and where the funding comes out. Is this all about funding that we're getting from the government? Does that explain the uptick?
So this is really interesting, and this is not really captured in the data when it comes to specific policy interventions or keywords. I think Jeff mentioned in the question. What I've tried to do is include data fields that provide a basis for this kind of analysis. So with things like vectors and technologies, and including project dates when I can, that gives us the kind of basis against which to analyse the kind of history and trends in the sector. But in terms of applying specific policies to it, there's nothing inbuilt within the database that says, you know, that clocks when the feed-in tariff stopped or when renewable heat incentive kicked in and that sort of thing. So we need to kind of do that retrospectively, but there's no reason why we couldn't do it. So that's why this kind of basic project information is so useful, is because it doesn't take a lot to provide a good basis for that kind of more, the next level up of analysis and people tailoring the analysis to their own specific areas.
Great, thank you, Callum. So we've got a question for Theo now from Jeff Hardy. Can your work tell us anything about the places that would really benefit from LES that are currently free of them? So that, I think, speaks to Charlie's point, particularly about the levelling up.
So thanks, Jeff, for a nice question. The thing is that, you know, it becomes a bit descriptive in the way of addressing this once we have identified the conditions associated, in the sense that, you know, we know that areas that don't have this, for example, these conditions are not very likely to have those projects. So if we want to target specific areas, maybe we should start looking for areas that are particularly energy poor and map them, or they're low on income, or they have specific socioeconomic characteristics that the government wants to change, map them and see whether they have, and then map them again and see whether they have any existing LES. And if they don't, that means that they are less likely to be, to have those developed in the future, like maybe in other areas. So then you can start developing maybe some ad hoc interventions on specific kind of areas, having those characteristics and helping the local communities within those areas to accumulate, to get this knowledge and maybe introduce businesses that can help them develop those. So it's a pretty much a solution of checking, checking what needs to be done and doing it in a rather ad hoc perspective, not in an automated that I can develop projections about areas and say what needs to be done. But in order to do that, I need someone to tell me exactly, like, what are the characteristics that we need to target? Like, do we want energy poor areas? Do we want like ex-coal areas, like in the north of England that are left behind? So what exactly are we looking for in this strategy for scaling up?
So gap identification and filling. Charlie, anything from you on that question? Which was about from Jeff. Oh, I think it's gone now because I asked it.
That's okay. Would just briefly that I think I'm more cautious about the idea of targeting specific areas in order for them to develop SLES projects, but I think it makes much more sense from a sort of policy rationale point of view to target areas which might be lacking the capacities or the resources to exploit opportunities to develop SLES projects. So a simple example might be, there'll be some areas which have acute local network balancing constraints and yet lack capacities, whether it's in their local economic activities, whether it's in relevance of skills available in that area, whether it's in strategic direction and leadership from local authorities and other local actors. They might lack those kind of conditions that Theo's analysis showed was associated with successful SLES projects historically. So I think that's probably more how I would answer the question, rather than identify sort of specific areas and then, for example, co-finance a SLES project in those areas.
Yeah, I think that makes, one of the things that you covered there was that obviously the network availability, or the in essence, there is a problem in the area that SLES is aiming to solve. And in some areas, maybe at the moment, they don't have that problem. Perhaps in the more urban areas was something that occurred to me. So there's a question here about the, I guess, how can we ramp up those community and local energy systems in the UK, Charlie? So you've talked about the skills, and one around whether the local electricity bill might act as a bit of a driver for these sorts of structures.
Oh, sorry.
Charlie, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I'm on a very laggy, I'm so sorry, I'm on a very laggy connection. Maybe put that one to Callum or Theo.
Theo, I'll let you jump in.
To be honest, I'm not really familiar with the local electricity bill, so I would put that to Callum if he can help me with, at least put me into context.
Yeah, at least on the ramping up question, I noticed that they say, we spend a lot of time kind of looking backwards, and meanwhile nothing really seems to be changing at the required rate, and kind of mention goodbye to 1.5 degrees and hello to 2+ degrees. I would say that there is a degree of retrospective analysis that is required, so that we can take an informed approach about what we do next. There is a lot to be learned from these past examples, even in a sector that's changing as quickly as this one. So they can tell us kind of what works and what doesn't work. They can tell us what technologies people want, what behavioural changes they do or do not want to accommodate. So there is a tremendous amount we can learn, and a lot of my research looks at these kind of barriers to upscaling and remove all of them. And the end goal of that is to kind of increase this ramping up or rolling out, whatever you want to call it. And I do keep coming back to knowledge sharing and dissemination from previous examples. That's in part influenced by the nature of the research I'm doing, but that's how we develop. That's how innovation happens in the sector, is that we try things and some things work and some things don't. And if we can shift towards a more sort of holistic definition of what works and what doesn't, away from does this project provide return on investment, I think we could unlock a lot of scalability by including kind of less tangible success factors and scaling those instead of relying on a kind of more commercial approach. But yeah, I think it will come, and there's all sorts of new technologies. Energy Rev has things like AI and all that sort of stuff included within it. So there is all this technology coming that I think will help immensely, but I would just kind of stick up for the retrospective analysis a little bit, because I do think it has a crucial role to play.
Theo, do you want to try and tackle that one, or do you think Callum has covered that? You're on mute. Sorry, Theo. So
no, I think Callum did, responded very well. I really, agreed with most of the things mentioned, and overall, retrospectively in the future, we need to identify like specific, trial and error, see what works and what not, and maybe trying to replicate this if we want to have more of this develop on a local basis by local actors. But just giving incentives, and they can pop up by doing this, once others, maybe neighbors, have done it as well. So that's pretty much the idea of having spillovers effect. And I've accumulated, because there was this discussion about there was, I think, a question about local actors and how they can be interested in replicating in other areas if they do it just in their area. I believe it's not about incentivizing them to replicate this because they're interested in the local area, and that's acceptable and that's fine. It's more of a building like a narrative and building some knowledge, which maybe some leaders within that area can do some sessions or share this knowledge with some neighbors or some other areas, and help to the transition of knowledge to other people that can replicate that. So it's not per se getting those people that done it successfully, getting to the other areas and replicate it. Maybe people from the industry, from the private sector might be willing if there's a profit in it, but the rest, it's not about getting them to other areas and trying to replicate. That's not really, I think I wouldn't be successful in any case. Given the local characteristics, the local focus of those projects. Yeah,
so they're all very locally specific, and I guess one of the questions it's asking about sort of designing the database and capturing key social impact benefit data. And one of the things that occurred to me was the sort of the diversity of each of these projects, and actually designing that sort of information when it would vary so wildly, I guess, between each project. Or and then a further question really about that data on how many projects have been successful in the full commercialization. So a lot of these, I imagine, are still in process and early stages, and some may not have quite made it to that end stage, but then there's important lessons to be learned from there as well. Charlie, do you want to come in? Are you with us? Have you got a lag?
Yeah, I mean, on that last point about success, it's a really important one, and certainly from the work Theo and I did with the energy system demonstrators database, there weren't formal success criteria included in either the quantitative or the qualitative data that we had on each project. So we were taking each project as having started, I suppose. And I mean, I think most of them had also completed, but many of them had the characteristics of being demonstrators. They were sort of intentionally experimental in some way and trying to prove market concepts or technological concepts. And so even what you mean by success is something of a sort of subjective set of criteria. So we didn't analyze that specifically. One thing we did look at, which Theo mentioned in his penultimate slide, was whether areas which had projects earlier on last decade were more likely to have subsequent projects, if you like, building on the skills base and experience that they'd accumulated through the first projects. And we did find that was a significant factor in the analysis. Conversely, we didn't find any strong evidence of spatial spillovers. So we didn't find any evidence that if an area had had a few projects, that knowledge, expertise and experience might spill over to then implement other projects in neighbouring local areas. So neither of those two things is explicitly about success, but they are to some extent about sort of persistence, longevity and scaling.
That's really, yeah, that's really interesting actually, because that gives you quite a challenge if you've got an awful lot of rather diverse and specific projects, which are, I guess, quite resource intensive and require quite a lot of people and resource to make them work. And then you're looking to roll that out across the UK. Is there, so this is my question actually, is there a way to make that more efficient? I think we've talked about, there's a question about the role of private sector and I guess dissemination and learning is a key part of that. Is there anything, I guess, from the UK government, from sort of national policy that could make that rollout, spillover, learning process work better? Do you know anything about the local energy bill? I don't have a lot of detail on it. So maybe that is a way to do it, but are there other things that you would ask from a sort of national government in terms of regulation? Callum, do you have any thoughts about
that? Just on the local energy bill, my understanding is that it would enable smaller scale generators to act as energy suppliers, and that is one of the, so the rest of my research that I briefly mentioned at the start and these case studies of previous examples, a lot of the barriers that these projects have run into that we're picking up on is to do with this kind of the limits that are placed on smaller scale energy generators and the extent to which they are able to act as suppliers and introduce alternative tariffs and so on, particularly at the small scale, is a real barrier. So I don't know the ins and outs of the local electricity bill, but the principle definitely addresses something that's that we've picked up on as a kind of major barrier. Fantastic.
We've only got a few more minutes left. Charlie, did you have any final reflections?
I mean, just on that, on your question about how government can sort of support, if you like, sort of more rapid diffusion of best practice and insight. I mean, this is at the heart of sort of diffusion studies, and there are lots of sort of generic lessons around, you know, making information and knowledge kind of collectively available, particularly through interpersonal networks and connections. And I think in that sense, the PIFA program, not just in its funding of the demonstrators and then the more sort of the more earlier stage commercial projects, but also in its attempt to kind of build broader networks and a momentum behind this new SLES concept is really positive.
Fantastic. Theo, final word from you.
One final point, because I've seen like a question about local needs and opportunities for how, unless they plans based on local needs and opportunities. Just to briefly state that it's not been discussed today, but we had this analysis on clusters, of specific clusters of less projects, and that's I will put it on the link, maybe people can read it. And the idea is that we've identified that, as Callum showed, that all the maybe projects were more DNO focused, on the more like on the network improvement as such, but later, more advanced chronologically, projects are not that much targeted in terms of specific local needs about the network, but are more related to multivector, the smart system, and they embody more of those aspects. So we see this transition in terms of local needs that later more advanced projects are becoming to absorb like lots of different needs in terms of the local area, given EVs are taking the lead now and are becoming more mainstream, and all that stuff that needs to be dealt with in the local network.
That's fantastic. Yeah, it's been a really great discussion. Thank you, everybody. The reflection from me, the amount of these different projects that we're seeing pop up across the UK is really, really encouraging, and that they're all developing new ways to see how they can benefit locally from energy and develop their own energy system. And I'm really hopeful that in the future, the system at the moment, which is seen very much as a national and everything is done across the UK or a DNO area, we hope in the future that is going to start to break down and really start to bring sort of local energy systems forward, and won't have people more invested in energy in their local area and what they can do to sort of transition to net zero. So it's really positive. Thank you so much, everybody who has spoken. So thank you to our speakers and to Charlie and to everyone who has sat on the call. And I've actually finished us 2 minutes early. This will be recorded and sent out after the meeting, and I think I shall close it there. Thank you, everyone.